So today I'm interviewing Rufus Pollock, my dear husband, the man I fell madly in love with about a decade ago now. And I really wanted to interview him because I think he has so much insight, wisdom in reading and making sense of the world. And today I particularly wanted to interview him because I'm having conversation with people and there's a generally sense of like, uh, despair in the political system, despair in human being, and therefore looking into technology to save us, and and the sense of disempowerment that exists in the world. And I remember about now maybe something like 7 or 8 years ago, I had this conversation with a friend, and Rufus, who kind of, through his extraordinary knowledge of history and economics, explained a bit to us how come we are in this situation with so much despair. That there has been a systematic lobbying and political movement to allow us to be where we are today. And so basically, I'm going to try to interview you, Rufus, so that your fruits of your knowledge can be shared with many more people. So welcome, my dear love.
Thank you. Well, and I hope it's going to be a dialogue. There'll be times I'm interviewing you and vice versa. But yeah, today is more that setup.
So basically, I'd
Welcome.
love it if you could share with people a little bit when you said you read a book a while ago that explained well, because for a long time, let's say the Republican Conservative Party was not very popular. Um, and the progressive slash Democrat were more popular. And you explained to me a little bit how, um, like um, what the Republican and evangelical Christian were doing to regain more power. And we're now seeing that, Trump has been elected now twice. The Supreme Court is more like has a more Republican domination. And so I'd love it if you could just give a lecture and explain to us how, in your understanding, and how come we're in this situation today.
Sure. Um, well, so I'm trying to remember what the books were, first of all. I think to start with, I think there are a couple of phrases or kind of slogans that we have internally at Life Itself that we've thought about in this area. So one was that, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was persuading you he didn't exist. And the kind of analogy is the greatest trick, whatever section of politics, but maybe the right wing has pulled in the last like 50 years is persuading you the state doesn't work and government doesn't work. And it's only about kind of individuals, and the state is the minimum to basically enable a market, or basic essentially. So this point that I think the point of that story about the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was persuading you didn't exist. There's a double part of that as well. It's not just that persuading you that um, the kind of state doesn't exist or it doesn't function, but also that there wasn't someone pushing this narrative. So the context for me, just to kind of rewind here a little bit of where I saw this, was I spent about 20 years and I'm still involved in, I guess, what you would say is um, digital activism and often technology oriented activism for better societies. And my particular area was around open data and open knowledge, that if we had more access to information as citizens, um, and we had more information, we could make better sense of what was going on, hold our politicians to better account, participate better in our society, etc., etc. But my point was, whatever I did, I was around a lot of people who were into what I would call civic tech, tech for good, using technology to make society better in some way, often socio-politically. And that could be, you know, ranging from, well, will get all this data and show you the best way to get to work, you know, kind of what is kind of Google Maps now, to, you know, a lot of stuff about transparency. You know, where does money go? I was involved in a project called Where Does My Money Go? That was helping show citizens where their money went to. And in theory, you know, more broadly, there's many efforts in other countries to even stop corruption. Um, and I think a little bit of an internal joke for us at the time started to become, you know, you know, a problem in our society. There's an app for that, and that was something that at least I was personally never convinced of. I was given my historical context, and I think many other reflective people in that space were aware of. There was always the distortion of money as well, that like where money was coming from was often philanthropy and particularly tech driven philanthropy now, or tech funded philanthropy. But the point was, what was very noticeable to me um, was that all these people, there was this great obsession with technology, but almost no interest in participating in politics. The way you were going to participate in politics was through some technology, and normally that technology was, while it wasn't explicit, was implicitly individually based. It wasn't about it. There was some stuff about like making the state run better, but if it was even with stuff like government as a platform, like this thing O'Reilly had, which was to envision government like Google or some other technology platform, and it was basically just about making it more efficient. You know, you should be able to easily, I don't know, interact with your government services to get your social security check or renew your driving license online. Now, while I think that's valuable and it's one of the things government do, um, it's any more kind of deeper student of politics and government would think that was quite a minor thing that government does relatively.
Can you
Um,
say a little bit more to that?
right. So if
I'm like, so what does the government do?
right, what does the government do? So, well, I mean, fundamentally, I mean, there are a variety of things, but the most obvious other thing the government does is it actually makes decisions about what should be, where money should go in society, what we should spend money on.
Which is
Uh,
what we should value.
yeah, should we spend money on education? Should we spend it on our army? Should we spend it on new hospitals? And then collect that money and distribute it. But my point is, if you thought of it as just like, hey, it's just there, like one way you could think of the money is government as just a large insurance agency, for example. So you could see healthcare as just like the government's just a very either an efficient or an inefficient healthcare insurer where it collects money from people in their taxes and then pays when they get sick. And basically, you just want that to be as efficient as possible. You want it to be very easy to go on your phone on an app and get what you want from the government. But it's true that this is one way that obviously many people experience the government today, at least in many um, many societies today, because of the way the government has taken now plays a role in so many of our interactions. In running our lives, from education through to healthcare through to like driving. But the thing behind that is that government sets budgets, but it sets policy. I mean, government and the government is us in the way, I mean, at least in a democracy and even in authoritarian systems, there is some aspect of the will of the people playing a role, at least by lip service. But the point I'm trying to say is that when we collectively, through the government, more or less effectively, we're making choices about what is allowed, what we support, what we spend money on. And so the idea that government as a platform, and while it was maybe obviously people who generated that slogan were aware of these other aspects, but it was this aspect of reducing the government to something like Google or another business. Like it's just Google's really great at doing its job. Like literally people would say it's like, look at, Google's web app works really well. Why don't government web apps work as well? Because obviously many of us had experience in the 2000s of quite poor government technology. But I'm saying all of this, which was the way that this era I was in, which was technology oriented, but even technology for good, even in that area, let alone like just technology for profit or technology, classic startups, had this mentality that you built technology that was largely individualistically oriented. It was about allowing individuals to do something and then somehow together through the market or through voting or something they would coordinate. but it wasn't about classic movement building or political action. And I was maybe it's again just a I was historically informed. I also was at Cambridge at this point where I was involved in this stuff. I was also an academic and I was running this nonprofit. And it was noticeable me talking to some of the older academics and just knowing what I knew about history that, like in the 70s, most people my age who were politically engaged, like these tech people were politically engaged. That's why they'd come into this area in a way. They wanted to change, make society better. Often were interested in politics and progressive in many ways. In the 70s, they would have all been joining like the Marxist or becoming Maoist or something. Now, I'm not saying that was better, but what I'm saying was they weren't thinking, oh, I'm going to make a startup or start a tech-driven nonprofit, and that's going to be how I do good. And to come back to the story, which was, I sometimes jokingly point out that they were kind of living in the dream of the American Enterprise Institute. And if people don't know that, that's like one of the leading right-wing American kind of think tanks, kind of funders, is the American Enterprise Institute of a kind of pro-business, pro-market, less government direction. Over the it's founded, I don't know if it's exactly founded, but certainly since the 70s has been very influential. And I was, joking that even though we were all thought of, probably most of those people were progressives and they'd have voted Democrat in the US or something in the Green or Labour in the UK or whatever it was in Europe, they were actually living inside of a worldview that was in many ways derived from right-wing ideology, going back to Hayek. And again, I'm not trying to dismiss right-wing ideology. There are things to be said for, you can talk about libertarian or anti-government or so on views, but that it was unwitting. And the greatest trick the American Enterprise Institute had kind of pulled was to have created this mentality, but no one to realize that they were living inside of that. Um, and that it was really shaped, the skillfulness of that is that when you're living inside of a worldview you don't realize, when you're the fish in a water and you don't see the water, everything that you try and invent as a fish is going to be water based. You don't see the possibility of other ways of operating. So, whatever function as water you're going to do, you can't imagine being out of the water on the land. And so, for example, you're not really going to get involved in social and political movement building. You're going to build and literally, I'm going to build an app that will tell, people. I was having friends, building an app, and people are going to fill in their answer 10 questions, and then they'll be told which person they should vote for in the election, as if this was really the path to deep political change. And I think it's almost easier now, 20 years on. This was the mid 2000s to late 2000s, nearly 20 years on. I think we're much more aware of the limitations and the dangers of technology in many dimensions. But at that time, just the infatuation. I mean, people got to remember, I think in 2010 to about 2012, when I was looking at this, these kind of, I mean, before that, I was researching search engines because I thought search engines were a monopoly and writing papers about it. But search engines like Google was the number one ranked brand in the world. Like people, if you ask people what brand they like the most, it was like Google. Coca-Cola came like fifth or something like that. I don't remember what it was, but just the kind of positive infatuation we had with technology. So that was one point, which is the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was persuading you he didn't exist. So the greatest trick, I guess you'd say the reactionary ideology I would look at least kind of high going, of the last 50 years has pulled is persuading you it didn't even exist and this was just the way it was. The state is dysfunctional. If only the state could be run better like Google, that would be wonderful. And that's what it is, and it's not very good. It's the other thing I think is people generally think the state is inefficient and corrupt, or both.
And that is what is interesting. Now we see that, for example, Elon Musk is putting satellite in the space, diffuser, how you say,
Yeah.
rocket.
It's,
All of that used to be NASA, used to be run by states, and is now one individual, private enterprise doing it. And like almost, I understand that like 50% of the satellites are actually owned by Elon Musk. And this kind of like ideology of like the state is corrupt and is inefficient, so private enterprise need to do it, and then like
Yes.
states fund private enterprise to do these um, to do this tech work, but it's not used by the like it's not owned by the people, it's owned by an individual. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we're today kind of like seeing that vision, that utopia that they had of like, and
Yes.
we're living it, but it's also a dystopia of,
Yes.
and in a way, like Trump used to be like was a businessman, and like
Yes.
and so we're kind of now living they're ripping the fruits of their labor of pushing, lobbying and pushing that ideology. And when we kind of, why I found fascinating is like, oh, what we're living today is the utopia of this group of people. But can you say what your understanding of what they did to push that agenda forward?
Right, right. I think there are two things. So just to remember, so part of so the positive version of that ideology is basically kind of Hayek, Friedrich Hayek and others, um, in the US, in the economics of the Chicago School, a whole bunch of ideology that essentially you want a minimal state, business is better, free enterprise is what you really want, and you could extend even, there's Buchanan and others like not only you even analyze politics in the kind of way of almost in a market like buying and selling in influence and things like that. But this ideology of the market is very strong and that through market coordination mechanisms or similar things, that's the best way to achieve ends. Um, I wanted to say so the things it done, like the state is the state is not good, the government is not, it's dysfunction, it's not effective. And the other aspect of that is collective action, because that's what the government is sort of the epitome of, is an attempt to organize for collective action. And I should say, well, what do I mean by collective action? What I mean is when we need to coordinate together to achieve some end, we can't achieve normally, actually, ironically, through individual coordination. Um, the classic example, I don't know, we all need to build a wall around our city to protect ourselves from attackers. Well, no one of us can build that wall normally. And or we need to build an irrigation system. An irrigation system is a system. It needs to have many, the pipes need to flow across many people's different bits of land. We need to share the water out in relatively equal ways. These are things that we need to coordinate together. And the most obvious and classic one is always national defense. We can't individually buy national defense or an army very effectively because, for example, there's free ride issues. If you're paying for it, but I don't pay for it, I still benefit, and so on and so forth. Um, so, your question was how did they actually go about that happening? But just to reiterate, that's the kind of so you don't engage in political and social organizing, which is classically how you'd go about engaging in collective action. You're like, oh, we don't. You either deny these collective action problems exist, or you're like they can be somehow solved by the market indirectly or some other way. Um,
Okay, I
and
maybe I'm getting,
yeah,
sorry, a
yeah,
little lost. I
yeah.
think
So
the first, like, can I say, so when you spoke, I was like, well, maybe the government is not super effective, like Elon Musk seems to have done a
yeah,
better job in effectiveness, maybe in like building his rockets than the NASA had have been possibly. So they might be,
yeah. We
a
don't.
valid
Yeah,
point to that. And another point I'm having is that what I sit uncomfortably with it is that it's how much power one individual or like owns.
yes. So what I mean, you're coming to, so what's the problem of that? So one is um I mean, first of all, there's just a basic point that often what is actually described as a vision for like free enterprise and free markets isn't really, it's basically pro big business. It's basically a semi even fascist ideology because classically, like fascism always got in bed with big business because big business has various kind of things. And this is a story of the 80s. Like there were all these people talking about free markets, but they didn't actually implement free markets most of the time. What they did was favor big business in a variety of ways, and or favor. They didn't actually endorse like really. strong competition norms and things like that. So just to say that is one point. And so, but your
And
kind of question is,
that's
what
really,
happens?
wait,
Yeah.
wait. Can you say, for example, like how that shows up with the current situation with Elon Musk?
Well,
Has Elon Musk
so,
received
so
quite
to
a lot?
let me just give a very quick example is Musk has received Musk and Tesla would not exist without government subsidies, very often very generous government subsidies, which Musk has spent millions and millions of dollars lobbying for in, for example, the California state legislature and the federal government legislature to provide him with subsidies for often subsidies, by the way, which probably from an economics point of view, not very good. They're mainly regressive. They take money basically from the poor and give them to the rich. Very generous subsidies for people buying expensive Teslas. And so
And
that's one way the government has supported that. But you're asking how is it
wait.
anti-competition? Yeah.
And so that makes it that it's not really a free market because there is a government intervention there.
Well, well, exactly. It's not a pure exactly. It's not a pure free market at all. Exactly in that regard. Um, I mean, obviously things today is. I mean,
That's what you mean by the fact that they're not really free market. They're actually pro big.
yeah, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff. You go back to Reagan, where like they talk about this, but the actual way they behave is, for example, to basically they like will do things which maybe they'll take down protections for consumers, which is a form of deregulation, but they won't really deregulate rigorously in other areas or actually, actually open up for competition in certain ways. I mean, we'd have to go into a little bit of depth or do things like kind of a variety of bailouts. For example, they deregulate. I mean, this is going into Reagan history, but they deregulate like the savings and loans market, which is this kind of part of the banking market, which with classically disastrous consequences because let's just take banking regulation, a really classic example. Okay. So let's say there's two models, which is you regulate banks quite a lot. Like you say, okay, you're not allowed as a bank to invest in cryptocurrency because it's really risky, or you're not allowed to investigate in, you can't just take your money that you're taking from your savers in a bank and go and gamble it at the racetrack. That is not allowed, right? Whereas in a normal company, if I take money from the stockholders, I can kind of do. I mean, they can then sue me if I lie to them and fraud them. But I'm just saying is in a bank, there's a lot of things I'm not allowed to do with the money I get given by depositors, by people who save their money with me. And the other side of that bargain in the US classically was that the government guarantees your bank deposit up to a certain amount, right? There's this insurance. And the idea of this is this will then prevent bank runs, people panicking when things go bad. And it also means you don't have to worry too much about your bank. When you go and open a bank account, you don't have to sit there and say, okay, but what is this bank doing? Are these bankers guys who are going to go off to like the racetrack and bet all my money, or are they really conservative, sensible people? I kind of know that A, they're regulated about what they're going to do, and B, my money's insured up to quite a reasonable level. But for example, one of the things Reagan and others did in the 80s that you could say is classically sort of pro-business was they essentially removed a lot of the regulations about what these savings and loans, which were a special kind of bank. I mean, I'm being a bit technical, you call them a bank, but basically they were places people put a lot of deposits, particularly from, and it was a lot of funding of mortgages, people's home mortgages. And they basically said, you can now invest in loads of other stuff. You don't have to invest in these very conservative things that you were allowed to invest in before, but we'll still guarantee your deposits. And then what happened? I mean, of course, a whole bunch of them went off and did really, really risky things, lent money in a whole bunch of ways that were very dangerous, and then lost hundreds of billions of dollars, sometimes in fraudulent ways. And guess what? The disciplined free market thing is they go bankrupt. The savers who've put their money in those institutions lose all their money. That would be the free market thing to do, right? Because then those guys are disciplined. They're like, in the future, those people will learn that, you don't put your money in a savings and loan without really checking it. But did that happen? No, they all got bailed out by the government.
Mm.
And similar things would say in the 2008 crisis.
Mm.
And obviously the things today, like tariffs and all this other stuff, is definitely not free enterprise and free market stuff. But so essentially,
So the whole story we're saying here is basically saying there's a packaging of an ideology saying we're for free market.
yeah,
Like that's the story that is being sold.
part
Un
of it, yeah.
part of that story. But underneath, what is happening is that actually we're for pro big business
Right.
because there's in ways that we both support them financially to expand the kingdom of their business, and another way is also when they fail, we bail them out.
We bail them out.
And so
And I,
it's not
yeah,
really competition. Like if you fail and take a risk as an entrepreneur, and does it like in the entrepreneur mindset, there's like taking risk, and taking risk means that if it doesn't work out, you bear that risk. But
exactly.
you're bearing that, but you're not really bearing that risk because you're being actually pulled out when things didn't work out. And who is absorbing that risk is actually the government, and who are the government is the people, including the working class people.
Yeah. So that's one, I mean, that's one aspect of it, which is that that ideology is not even um, honestly endorsed. I think the other
Right.
way,
So
what I'm
there's a
saying, yeah, that's one way. Yeah.
so there's a kind of what you're trying to point out is that the ideology is not integrous with itself,
That's
basically.
part of it. And even if it were integrous, we could come to it being dysfunctional. But yes, it's basically often used as a cover for, at least particularly in the United States, for enriching the business section of the population.
And we're
Yeah.
now seeing that partially with like more and more inequality that has grown massively. And
Right.
just
Yeah.
I
Keep going. Yeah. Yeah.
I know that you wrote your book Open Revolution that covers also more the reason behind the inequality that we're seeing, and maybe in a different podcast we'll start covering
Yeah.
that. But right now, I want to go back to my point. My question is like, how did they push this ideology forward? Like, did they lobby?
Yeah.
How did they go about to pushing this ideology forward?
Well, and I think this is really interesting for a couple of reasons. So we're going to go through that. And the thing to also remember is to say we can also kind of maybe not admire it, but like we could learn. And I mean, people in general, and also people interested in maybe having a different social and political narrative, like we have at Life Itself, for a new paradigm thinking, is that in a way they advocated at the time, starting in this is going back even to the 40s and 50s, where it originated what was a new paradigm? Because at that time, the kind of pro-government and pro-collective action was at a height. After the Second World War, so just to go back a little bit to set a bit of history, you know, there was the Great Depression in the 1930s. Out of that, in the US, I'm just going to pick the US here, but it goes for a lot of Western Europe and a lot of the world. I mean, they didn't become communist, but the move in society was massive. Like the amount of government intervention in society in the 1930s under Roosevelt was just dramatic. Like, they were building highways, they're building huge amounts of housing. The government is employing huge numbers of people directly in work programs. And in the Second World War,
Can I ask,
yeah.
was the tax rate quite high then?
So certainly from the 40s onwards and 50s in the Western world, in the US, in England, in France, in Germany, you have rates of taxation on the top income earners over 50% on their income and on unearned income. So both to be clear, earned income is like I go out and I work and I actually do something. The other is like I've earned income, I have capital, and I'm investing it and I'm receiving what would be called unearned income. You have rates of taxation on unearned income that get up to 90%,
Wow.
right? 80, 90%. So,
That
th-
was in during like Second
so
World
no, no, this is from the 50s and 60s, 50s,
War.
60s, and 70s. But they started to come down and famously, like, Reagan slashed the tax rate. In the 60s in the US, that is the kind of tax rate you have. And this is not considered, crazy. This is now kind of mainstream thinking of like what would be called kind of Keynesian social democracy mindset. I mean, the US is always different. Western Europe is even stronger, particularly the Nordics. But you have this massive reduction in inequality in a period of also very significant material growth, GDP growth and economic growth for everyone. So and Social Security comes in. The US never gets universal health care, but it gets close. You have the Great Society program. I mean, you have the New Deal in the 1930s, but you have this Great Society program under Johnson, the war on poverty in the 1960s. As a really conventional thought, it's like this is the way we do society. And,
So,
being
so what
engaged
is
in
that way?
politics is cool.
What
Yeah.
is that way of engaging in
Well,
society.
so it's like we are going to have significant taxing and redistribution. The government is pretty involved in many areas of society. In fact, government may, there's a variety of government may, it doesn't mean government takes over. It's not becoming a nationalized state, though. Many countries, there's very significant nationalization of, electricity generation. Many countries, healthcare is somewhat nationalized. Um, steel, coal, I mean, a whole bunch of industries. Most countries, that look at the US, AT&T, in the US always is a slightly weird exception, but American telephone and telegraph and telephone, which becomes this kind of regulated monopoly. It's never nationalized. In the Western Europe, they're mostly nationalized. So British Telecom, the UK, is owned by the government. France Telecom is owned by the government. Deutsche Telekom is owned by the government. In the US, it's this specially regulated industry, which is kind of almost quasi-governmental. I mean, it's allowed,
So
and
you're
the
just
government role in society and the way it's seen as government is trusted. Government, this is a way large-scale government intervention society works, is the view. And you've got to just say, just to really see the origin, I mean, the US, in a war economy, the government does take over. And you might in the US, again, in the US, they don't actually nationalize industries in the 1940s during the war, but basically they direct what industry produces to a very great, I mean, you have what looks like a planned economy to some extent in the 1940s in various countries, like a social economy. And it's a success. It's a success. So people are sitting there saying, this works. And that, you've got to remember, this is the point when Hayek and others, Milton Friedman and others, start. They're very lonely at that point. There's no one else who thinks much like them, who are saying the story of like, actually, no, this is wrong, the market, blah, blah, free enterprise, the market,
so,
government's
so
too big.
let's slow down for a moment.
Yeah,
On we're
yeah,
covering a lot, and we're speaking a bit fast in my view
yeah,
of how because it's a lot of information. Basically, if I'm kind of trying to make it simple,
yeah,
like you're taking us back in time. So we're back
yes,
in time. We're like in the 50s or in the 60s. And what is the ideology then? What is the water people swim in that they believe in? Which is like, actually, the government is effective and is a success. Like, look at the Marshall Plan, Marshall
the
Plan,
way the Marshall Plan,
like the government's uh, involvement in the country is good. And back then, basically, those kind of free market ideology, enterprise ideology are kind of quite unpopular, a bit underground, not seen. And how that shows up is that being involved in politics for young great minds was the cool thing to do, was to be involved. Whereas, and compared to today, now we're in different waters, and that different waters, what it looks like is that most young great minds either go into startups, creating enterprise, or in finances. They don't
yes.
go and become public servant. And there's this general sense that governments can't resolve collective action, but big business, like business can.
Yes.
Okay, so you're explain like what you're showing us is like there's two waters. And how did we, and why I'm asking is how did we go from one water to this different water? And that we realized there were different waters in the past. And
Yes.
also to grab the less, like there may be not, it's neither all good or bad in both ways, but there is a limitation in and to realize if we want to kind of, to understand that there's this shift in water so that we can choose to shift waters again.
Exactly. And so I think so just to kind of setting up to say this was a concerted and often conscious effort, starting with maybe actually some intellectuals. And there was always a sympathy for free enterprise and pro big business, particularly in America, but in general, my businessmen. But that really, starting in the 70s, for a variety of reasons that we can come to. And again, I'm going to focus on the US, but systematically there's this reaction. And just to kind of name the dates, 19, I think 78, Likud gets elected, which is a right-wing political party in Israel. And this is probably quite an obscure fact for most people, but Israel was a classic, it'd be dominated by the Labour part, what's called the Labour, and the left wing kibbutzniks in Israel very successfully. And then Likud won. a kind of right-wing, more nationalist, more religious-oriented party in 78. 79, Thatcher gets elected in Britain, Margaret Thatcher, on the Conservative platform, and Reagan is elected in 1980. And while in other countries it's kind of later, there's this kind of just massive tsunami of this pendulum swinging back. Now, we could come back maybe later to what the origins of that were at a popular level. I think certainly there was a reaction to the 60s and the 70s at a quite a deep, sometimes moral level of the overreach of what happened in that system, in the old system. So any approach always has its downsides. But essentially, but let's start with how did this change happen, which was your question. What happened?
Yes, you're saying that there was an overreach, a reaction that people might have felt the government.
So for example, unions became very powerful.
Mm.
Unions got empowered. There was a lot of legislation passed that made unions more and more powerful, and unions then abused that. I mean, many places unions would create work stoppages. I mean, if you watch Faulty Towers, which is UK, one of the most famous sitcoms in the world. But Basil Fawlty, who's kind of definitely like probably a votes conservative even in the 70s in that movie. He's a little business owner, quite narrow-minded, a bit bigoted, but but that's not what I'm saying. But he's like, oh, another strike today. He opens the paper and says another strike today. It's like just in the mid 70s, you know, Britain has blackouts because coal miners go on strike. In the late 1970s, the rubbish men go on strike in this winter of discontent, and there's literally just rubbish piling up in the streets. Um, the coal miners actually bring down the Conservative government in England in the early 1970s. That the Conservatives take on the coal miners and saying, look, we're not going to give you wage increase or various other things. And the coal miners go on strike, and in the end, they win, and the Conservatives back down, and basically the government collapses. And it's when Thatcher came, one of the things Thatcher said she was going to do was going to break the you know, coal miners. But that overreach, and then the moral overreach. I mean, there was something, if you look at movies of the 70s, if there's something of a moral decay that you can sense. And you watch these movies, you watch um
Like sex, drug, and rock and roll.
well, but you watch Scorsese, like you watch Taxi Driver. New York is dirty. New York goes bankrupt in the 1970s. It's a time of real, also economic recession again, of like, there are big problems that are coming because of stagflation. And it's a time where, business, there's more and more regulation. You can imagine Nixon, who is a right-wing, I mean, a Republican at least, president, is passing major environmental regulation legislation. Like he's passing legislation that's like putting in new regulations. And on the one hand, there are two things. I think there's a resurgence of a sort of moral right-wing ideology of like, pro patriotism. On the birth side, it's kind of pro patriotism, pro moral values. It's like we are living in an era of decadence where kids are watching pornography, everyone's taking drugs. This is wrong. And that's certainly in the US. This is a moment when the American evangelicals, and that's what we'll come to about the story I told you those years ago, because I think this was a Chris Hedges book, partly American fascism, that I've been reading. And the evangelical right wing in the US wake up and become much more politically active. I mean, obviously, they've always, the US is unusual in having this block of voters who are basically still fundamentalist Christian or pretty close to that. And they are revolted. There's a kind of revulsion of what's going on, and all these hippies and all this stuff going on, and, no order anymore. And that group really are waking up and saying, okay, we're going to get politically engaged. And then the other thing is that business is waking up saying, look, we're being overregulated, we're being, taxed. This is not working for us in whatever way. Possibly combined with this moral kind of feeling of like, there's hippies on the production line, I can't even do what I want anymore. I'm constantly having to negotiate with the union. And that group come together. And on the big business side, they engage in like systematic lobbying. I mean, it's one of the things you can trace, which is the shift, at least in the US, in lobbying, really starts to happen in the 70s and then 80s. Like this really deep shift in the amount that business is spending to influence politics. And it kind of really takes off. And um, that that shapes a lot of what's going on. If you watch the movie about no, I'm forgetting our name, but the advisor to Trump, that wonderful guy with Nixon tattooed on his back. But he's kind of coming out of the 70s. Remember, he's this young Republican. That's it. No one would be a young Republican. Like the joke was, a young Republican is an offense against nature. Like it doesn't exist. And that dude is like, it's 72 or 74, and he is starting to kind of come through the ranks with his aggressive, like, we're going to win. And you've also got to understand the Republicans had lost for so long, in
Mm,
the US. The right, they'd just not been in power for 30 years, basically,
mm,
mostly. I mean, they'd occasionally won the presidency, but with Nixon, I mean, Nixon was kind of like, in those days, I said he passed all this regulation. I mean, he wasn't really that right wing. Eisenhower wasn't right. Today, Eisenhower would be a Democratic president in the US. Would today be, center left possibly. And the other really decisive thing, which is probably even more decisive, is the rise of the evangelical right and their desire to influence the Republican Party. So there's this kind of famous moment, in the 70s, like Nelson Rockefeller, who's from the Rockefeller family, governor of New York, is trying to get to become president. I mean, he eventually becomes vice president under Ford. And Rockefeller is seriously trying for the 1980 nomination, and ends up losing to Reagan. But that is the moment in the 1980 um, Republican kind of primary and then nomination is the moment when you really see the evangelicals come into their power. I mean, they have no time for Rockefeller, and it's the takeover of the Republican Party because the Republican Party had not been dominated by by the Christian right in any way before that, really. I mean, it was conservative in a variety of ways, um, but it was not, someone like Rockefeller was kind of like a classic businessman from a wealthy family, but and in the 80, nomination, and it's like Reagan gets nominated, that's the beginning. And obviously, by 2000, you don't become Republican nominee without the approval of basically the core Christian right groups. They're actually sitting in the meetings almost, deciding these things. And you've got to remember these groups are a small, relatively small minority of the US population, um, and their leadership, but they're highly organized, highly disciplined, and highly motivated. And there was also a rift, within the evangelicals, there were ones who always maybe felt about politics. They cared about who they voted for, but they never politically organized. And there was what were, I think, Hedges, I don't recall the imperialists, but there's a group that start to say, no, we're going to get systematically involved in politics. And that's what they do from the 70s onwards, to today. And they have an enormous influence. And part of it, that to kind of in terms of the learning on both groups, is they're persistent. They have the Christians are persistent partly because of funding, because there are a bunch of deep-pocketed donors, but it's a bit like the Jews, like they're highly organized. Like inside the Jews, not every Jewish person is well off, but the Jews, the group, are very effective because if there's some people who do get well off, they'll give money to Jewish causes. So you have these evangelicals. There are people still today, who've made a lot of money, but also this as a group that, there's churches. You can tell people kind of like, hey, we're doing this. They're great at organizing. They have a hierarchical or semi-hierarchical model to a great degree, like you listen to authority. Um, and on the business side, you have a lot of money. And the two of those things enable persistence.
mm,
So, starting in the 70s, you're taking almost this ideology, some of it on the business side, more this free marketology. Remember, there's this weird combination, which is evangelicals are actually kind of pro-government intervention. They want the government to say, we're a theocracy, basically. But they form this sort of a weird alliance. I mean, it's a still very unstable alliance, right, in the Republicans between cultural conservatives and basically fiscal or economic conservatives. And, for example, a whole bunch of libertarians think people should be able to get drugs and be gay if they want to and do whatever they want. The libertarians, but they've sort of made common cause for sort of weird reasons. But it's a very unstable combination, by the way. It's not a lasting combination. And it takes people like Trump to sort of dance between them now. Um, but essentially, they start organizing, and on the big business side, and both sides, they have this quite good model. You've got kind of ideas. I mean, now it's quite well studied, but you have these kind of people. You've kind of got intellectual source people like Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek. Often quite obscure people. I mean, who'd read Hayek? He's this kind of Austrian economist. and philosopher for quite a while. I mean, he went to LSE in the war, and but I remember my father having a copy of Hayek, The Road to Serfdom, which is, this completely ludicrous basic argument that the moment you start having any government, significant government intervention in your society, you're on the road to kind of the gulag, which is clearly not correct, really. I'm doing not disservice to Hayek a little bit, but and what they have is a model where you do that, and then you have kind of think tanks that start churning out policy papers that kind of produce the ammunition and the material that then your lobbyists and others can take. And you kind of go, and then you just spend a lot of time. You work at that for a long time. And I think the thing that's most interesting is there's obviously the direct, I wouldn't say corruption, but the direct, I hire a lobbyist, they just go and hassle someone, or I put money into a congressional district to elect someone. Um, but the more interesting thing is the way to shift worldview. That as you start to like put out enough of this material, people just start to take it on board. And you train the future elite. You train Supreme Court justices. You groom people who will become Supreme Court justices. You groom people who will get elected as senators. Again, like Thiel has been doing this. Like, JD Vance, the vice president, is one of Thiel's proteges. You spend this time over quite a long period, over maybe decades, preparing people who will then become in positions of power. Um, and yeah, you do that systematically. And I think this is interesting because you see this shift in other countries that don't have as weird a kind of, or as I would say corrupt in a way, and I don't mean directly corrupt, but kind of the American political system, money plays an enormous role in the American political system for a variety of reasons. But in countries where it's not so clear, you still have this ideological shift. And the ideological shift isn't just because of this manipulation or something, let me be clear. There's also a deep reaction. My father, who was not a radical conservative or reactionary, ends up, I'm pretty sure he voted for Thatcher, and he votes for conservative because he's sick of the kind of like the kind of the disease that had kind of started to spread of dysfunction. And so there is this kind of latent feeling for this of, free enterprise and freedom and entrepreneurship and all these things. Um, but it's a weird one. I mean, just to kind of go back, almost everything that the current tech world, which is incredibly free enterprise-ish, but also monopolized and concentrated, is almost all of it is built on technology government funded, and particularly US government funded through like DARPA. So, the internet, email, GPS, you name it. Like this stuff was basically funded by the US government and others. And, and even today, probably most of the battery technology in the world and most of the stuff that runs electric cars, if you went back to the base innovations, that's where it came out of. So yeah, to kind of finish that story, it's an example where, in particular, I think the Shushi thing is that there was this general social mood that shifted, but it was then manipulated, carried forward, and certainly channeled in political energy very skillfully by these groups. And to kind of finish the story of the devil, one of the very clever, just like really subtle things they did was let's say you think the government's useless, but or you even realistically know the government isn't useless, but you want it to be less powerful. What do? If we cut funding, for example, to research for the government. So let's say I cut the budget that each congressional member in the US has for research staff. I cut the budget that government members in general, for research the government does or for the bureaucracy. Well, suddenly congressional members don't have any research anymore. So when there's an important vote, where do they get information from? They don't have their own staff anymore in the same way. Well, they have to go and depend on some friendly lobbyist who's done all the work. Their think tank has spent several $100,000 writing up a report. Here's what you should think. Here's what you should vote, etc. And so this is one of the things they did in the US. They kept in the 80s and 90s, they kept cutting congressional budget for research staff and staff for congressmen. And congresswomen, and then they can sit there and say, look, they're idiots. They don't know what they're doing, and they can feed them stuff. And so you create this self-fulfilling prophecy. You basically disable government. And in other things, I mean, conservative governments, And this is again a more subtle story, just to finish, was because bureaucracy often is imbued with an ideology of the previous era. If you want to do radical change, you kind of have to you often want to attack the bureaucracy. I mean, you see Trump doing it right now, right? Like firing lots of the bureaucracy. And to be fair to Trump and Musk, that's quite a logical thing to do if you're trying to get quite a deep ideological change, because the bureaucracy, remember, unlike the politicians, are there for much, much longer. You know, you're often a career bureaucrat. So one of the other things that happened was that as the right-wing leaders came into power in the 80s, they obviously faced a bureaucracy that's basically got the old ideology. So the other thing they did was just to systematically attack the bureaucracy. In many countries, like they will remove, fired people, created their own basically parallel strategy capacity that was independent of the existing bureaucracy. And so there was this kind of general assault on governmental capacity in many ways, certainly in the most kind of Anglo-American areas. I mean, it affected everywhere, but it was stronger there. And so combined, you what the key point we want to really get to for everyone listening to this is that we are swimming in the water today of that world. And we don't realize it. We don't realize what it was like in the 60s. We can't really imagine. And we live in a world today where we assume government isn't very effective. The bureaucracy is venal. It's either taking money or self-interested or corrupt. It's there to keep their jobs or get a backhander or something like that. Politicians are there to be bought. You see it in every movie episode, you know, it's everything. People are, you know, there's almost no honorable politicians, or if they do, they immediately get kind of killed or fired or something like that. And the bureaucracy is also corrupt. And even many institutions, you know, the media, everyone's for sale. There's nothing to be trusted. We're in a world of cynicism and individual atomized individualism. You know, the one thing that's our savior is Musk or Richard Branson or some, you know, the
Yes.
entrepreneur's hero.
But at the same time, we're seeing the dark side of that also, that people are starting to kind of fear that concentration of power
Yes,
uh, of Musk. And so for a long time, Musk was a hero to so many people. It was like
yes,
now they're starting to fear that same hero. Um,
yes,
so it's an opportunity time because we also see the holes in the of that dream. Um, and so there's and why for me it was important to record and interview you is that to give a sense that, well, there is also something possible, something different possible. Now,
yes,
then the next question is going to be, what is that alternative? Because we ain't going back to the 50s, where right now is not working, and we're interested in a second renaissance, a rebirth, and often before that there's a dark renaissance, there's a period of decay, there's a period of seeing things not working, of the pendulum swinging again. And so what would be coming next? And we're not going to answer that question right now because we'll do another podcast on that. But thank you so much for like sharing your knowledge. What I love about you is that you're someone so deeply read and like creates a connection and have such a deep understanding in topics that are very obscure to many people like me. Economy, how the economy links to history, how that plays out with our relationship to tech, and how that plays out ideologically, like how these different things interconnect. And to approach that with rigor, but also a quite holistic understanding, while like to not also portray it as just good and bad, but just like, oh, the complexity of human politics and human governance, and so I think that's a very important story to be known.
yes. And I think to maybe just to end, not to say the future, but the way I would see it at the moment is we've lived in an era of a 50-year reactionary upswing. So just to say what reactionary traditionally means is someone who's reacting against the direction and wants to normally go back. And um, that I think is fairly clear that we've been in that period of people wanting to go, let's go back to family values, let's go back to the good old days, let's go back to the era of Queen Victoria, or the 50s or whatever it is. And the irony, you know, the irony of, by the way, just saying in the background is if you look at obviously the cultural trends, they've continued in the US. Like there's gay rights, there's gay marriage, despite this reactionary thing. And obviously that continuing progress has often animated the reactionary energy. And right now you might feel the reactionary energy has actually managed to even seize power, or is at the moment of potentially seizing some levers of the power in the US, possibly in other countries around the world. Um, the point to remember is that that is a reactionary upswing. And just as you said, the pendulum swings, is going to swing back. And the best news is the pendulum doesn't swing back to where it was. It's like the pendulum, in a Gust's case, the pendulum is moving. There is some kind of, I don't want to dare I say progress, but there is certainly evolution. Whether it's in a positive direction, we can come to. And so this is a moment when actually, while it might seem the heights, just like the 1970s seemed to be like the heights, late 60s and 70s was this like post-Second World War, liberal democracy, social democracy kind of boom, but it was actually the moment when the cracks were starting to show in that. So it's now the moment when I think that reactionary upswing is actually petering out. And more people, like you said, for example, see the dangers of techno oligarchy, of what is actually being behind this ideology and its ludicrousness. Like the idea, like, do we really think that Elon Musk is going to solve climate change by running Tesla? No, no one really thinks that. Does anyone think that we're going to reverse our ecological collapse because Bill Gates is, going to use his think foundation to fund stuff, for more clean energy? No, we know in our hearts that we need something that's bigger than any person like that, that's us together. And I think we've forgotten our power. Like we are, as a collective, truly powerful. And there's a new kind of way we can organize it. It's not going back either to like communism or socialism or something ism of the past. It's something new that's at the same time acknowledges the importance of collective action, of politics in the broad sense of politics, that the act of coming together to envision together and to act together for the good, that that possibility, while retaining our senses of autonomy and individuality that are very precious and of our kind of creativity and enterprise that come out of that. And there's something new to be born. And that I think this is a very exciting time. It's also a dangerous time, but it's a very exciting time for that reason.
Well, thank you so much. And I look forward for us to record more interviews where I get to reveal all these deep knowledge that you have. And I think so thank you so much. And thank you for listening. Um, this is an episode of Over the Mountains to realize that, well, there is a way through, but there might not be any shortcuts. And for that, we need to look deeply and think deeply and look rigorously and have the courage to climb that mountain, however difficult it might seem or impossible it might seem. And there is a path.
Beautiful.